Hey everybody, this video is called Vengeance on the Philistines, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Judges, looking at the 15th chapter, where we're going to look at Samson taking vengeance against the Philistines, and we're going to see retaliation is going to be a major focus in today's video. But chapter 15 verse 1 through 3 says, "After a while, in the time of wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat. And he said, 'Let me go in to my wife in her room.' But her father would not permit him to go in. Her father said, 'I really thought of that you thoroughly hated her. Therefore I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please take her instead.' And Samson said to them, 'This time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them.'" So in chapter 15 here, we see that Samson's tactfully made his move when the wheat harvest was taking place. And during the wheat harvest, it would put men at busyness at work. And this was probably taking place right around the month of May. And a token of reconciliation was offered as he brought a young goat. And that showed the father and the daughter that they had nothing to fear. And the flimsy excuse of "I thought" by the father was an effort to escape the trap that he was in. And he feared the Philistines if he turned on the new husband. Yet he feared Samson. So he goes on here to offer his second daughter as a way out of his situation. And back in Leviticus 18:18, it stated that this was an unlawful act taking place. And, you know, not just was it an unlawful act with the law of Moses, but this was insulting to Samson. And the cycle of retaliation will begin here and go through the next chapter, verses 30-31. And Samson was angry with his father-in-law, which most of us would be. But he should have never married her in the first place, as we covered back in the last video. And God used Samson's ungodly anger for his own purposes. As Psalm 76:10 says, "Surely the wrath of man shall praise you." And his anger obviously is not justifiable, but it shows the glory and the power of God to use all things to his purposes. You know, in Genesis 50 verse 20, you know, it says, you know, what man meant for evil, God meant for good. You know, God is sovereign even over the bad. And so verse 4 and 5, it says, "Then Samson went and caught 300 foxes, and he took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines, and he burned up both the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive groves." So verse 4 and 5, please don't let the PETA see this, because Samson would be under many criminal charges with this. But Samson insulted and provoked to fleshly resentment. And, you know, he goes on here to take vengeance on the Philistines. And it must have taken a while to catch so many foxes. You know, there's some people who say, you know, it's impossible for Samson to catch 200 foxes and, you know, and then keep them pinned and fed until they reach the 300. And, you know, foxes, some people see it as jackals. And apparently we see that he ties them in the pairs with a slow burning torch, and he sends them in pairs down the hills into fields that would cause the thrashing with fire and igniting the standing grain that was very dry at harvest. You see, right now, as we enter the month of August, a lot of places are like, it's so hot, it's so humid, it's so dry. You know, we start seeing forest fires, all that stuff. And in the same environment, these wheat fields were very dried out. And one point I want to make is that Samson, when he gets his revenge here, he obviously didn't take fire safety class, nor did he ever hear of Smokey the Bear telling him he's the only one that could prevent forest fires. But I wonder as well if it was as hot as dry as it's been this past week. And some say that that is a lot of foxes or jackals to catch. And there is nothing saying in these verses that he didn't do this over the course of more than one day, or that he didn't have any help with him. In verse 6 and 7 it says, "Then the Philistines said, 'Who has done this?' And they answered, 'Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her his companion.' So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. Samson said to them, 'Since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you, and after that I will cease.'" So the general principle of reaping what you sow that we know from Galatians 6:7, we see takes place right here. And God uses this whole scenario to advance his plan for Israel in their redemption. And Samson's disobedience, it came with a very great cost. And we have here the bitter story of retaliation that takes place, of trying to avenge wrong that was done to one. In verse 8 it says, "So he attacked them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. Then he went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Etam." And so this is proverbial for a ruthless slaughter. And you see, Samson was just a one-man army, unlike the other judges. He was a one-man army against the Philistines. And Samson at this point in time had no more family, and he could trust no one virtually. He literally had no one that he could trust. And so Samson has to live like a fugitive here, alone in a cave. In verse 9 through 13 says, "Now the Philistines went up and camped in Judah and deployed themselves against Lehi. And the men of Judah said, 'Why have you come up against us?' So they answered, 'We have come up to arrest Samson, to do to him as he's done to us.' Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, 'Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this that you have done to us?' And he said to them, 'As they did to me, so I have done to them.' But they said to him, 'We have come down to arrest you, that we may deliver you into the hands of the Philistines.' Then Samson said to them, 'Swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves.' So they spoke to him, saying, 'No, but we will tie you securely and deliver you into their hand, but we will surely not kill you.' And they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock." So the fact here that Judah's soldiers gave Samson over to the Philistines showed just how much they were under the oppression of the Philistines. And Samson, we see that he agrees to be tied down if they don't kill him. He agrees to be tied down. And, and what this shows here is that he responds in faith that, God, I'm putting this into your hands. My life is in your hands. In verse 14 through 17, it says, "When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. And so it was, when he had finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand and called that place Ramath Lahi." So we see that God gave miraculous power to Samson for the destruction, but we also see that this miraculous power was given for Samson. In verse 11 says, "Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, 'Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this that you have done to us?'" You know, the Israelites were in a fearful state. So part of the miracle that God was using through Samson with the jawbone was to show the fearful Israelites how big their God truly was. And not just that, but that also God was with them despite their lack of trust. And he did so as a one-man army, as I mentioned, against the Philistines. And we see that Ramoth Lehi is used, and that means Jawbone Hill. And that was the appropriate name for this place of Samson's great victory. And verse 18 through 20 says, "Then he became very thirsty. So he cried out to the Lord and said, 'You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now I must die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised.' So God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore he called its name En-Hakkore, which is in Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines." So we see here that the chapter ends with God working of a miracle, supplying a spring in response to Samson's prayerful cry while he was in thirst. And this place was called the spring of him that called, as you'll see later in Jeremiah 33 verse 3. And Samson, he needed this thirst to remind himself of his own weakness and his need right after such a great victory. You know, and you know, that is us as well. We cannot do this Christian walk by ourselves. We cannot be in a good standing relationship with God ourselves. We must be thirst, and Jesus supplies, you know, our ever-living fountain. And so to wrap up the chapter here, we looked at Samson's rage at discovering that his wife was given to another. And, you know, most of us, we would probably agree, you know, if our father-in-law gave our wives over to some other man, you know, there's probably going to be some problems. But we saw that Samson struck out against the Philistines by burning their crops. So we see that Samson, you know, it's like, all right, instead of, you know, going after the one man, I'm going to hurt the whole, you know, community. I'm going to burn down their crops, and they're going to lose a lot of profits and all that. And then we saw that the Philistines are like, you know what? You're going to burn our crops and set these animals' tails to burn down our crops. Guess what, guy? I'm going to blow you where it's going to hurt you most. We're going to take out your wife and family. And so we get to see in this chapter today the ripple effect of retaliation. And we see that, you know, mankind just wants to retaliate against one another. And, you know, when we go with unforgiveness, and when we don't leave matters in the God's hands, it just becomes a pattern. And then we see the ripple effect of Galatians 6:7 that says, you know, you reap what you sow. And, you know, as we wrap up today's chapter, we must really think that if we really trust God, we must rely that what God said in Romans 12:19 through the Apostle Paul, that vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay. You know, we must place retaliation in God's hands. We must trust that God's not going to let anybody get away with anything, that retaliation belongs to God alone, and that God will repay. And I want to go over to Matthew chapter 5, verse 38 through 42. Let's take a look at what Jesus taught when he did a sermon on the Mount on retaliation. So Matthew 5:38 through 42 says, You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. So, as mentioned, we see that Jesus is preaching to not do retaliation on his sermon to his disciples on the mount. But Jesus teaches here that they must control the situation by giving even more. They must be sacrificial, selflessness. And we see once again that Samson went on to repay the Philistines for the murder of his wife. And talking about retaliation, a lot of our problems around us today in society, war, bloodshed, all those types of things, disaster, a deep-seated hatred between people, and the pain of this world, it comes from our fallen nature of having that instinct that we must get justice, that we must retaliate on our own accord. But we saw the ending here where Samson goes on to slay the 1,000 Philistines, and then we also see that Judah is like, you know what, Samson, we don't got your back, buddy. We're turning you right over to protect our backs. So they turn Samson over to the Philistines. And when Samson's killing the 1,000 men here, he does it with a jawbone. And that's gonna wrap up this chapter today, as we saw that the chapter ends with God miraculously providing for Samson with the spring. And that's gonna be it for today. We'll see you next time, as we're gonna look next week at Samson's disgrace and death. So I hope you have a great rest of your weekend. God bless, and we'll see you this upcoming week.